Hello, I'm Tom Hartman in Washington, D.C., and welcome to The Big Picture. 8 years ago today, the United States was mired in the most serious economic crisis since the Great Depression. The unemployment rate was skyrocketing, the stock market was plummeting, and the global financial system was on the verge of total collapse. But then Barack Obama took office, and the world was saved from the brink of catastrophe, kind of. One of the great tragedies of the Obama administration was that it did not go far enough to reform the economy to prevent another meltdown like the one in 2008. Even so, now, what reforms the Obama administration did put in place are in serious danger. President Trump and the new Republican Congress are committed to a right-wing agenda of repealing the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act, cutting taxes for the rich, and slashing regulations, especially those that protect our environment and keep our water clean, our air breathable, and our children healthy. The banksters and corporate raiders are once again about to wreak havoc on the American middle class. And yet there might be some good news. If Donald Trump makes good on his campaign promises, the United States could radically restructure its trade policies, maybe even in a way that would benefit American workers. So what should we expect from the economy under President Trump? How much will he follow the traditional Republican right-wing agenda? How much will he deviate from it? And if he and his Republican cronies get their way, will that set off the next crash? Joining me now is Dr. Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the New School in New York City, founder of Democracy Works, and author of the new book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. Dr. Richard Wolff, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you with us. So what is the actual state of our economy right now, and how did we get here?
Well, we are still badly limping from the crash of 2008. It needs to be put in context. You know, it's the second worst crash of global capitalism in its history. The first one was back in the 30s. We came through that with great difficulty. A whole decade or more was lost. We thought we had figured out as a nation how to reform the economy so that this horrible collapse wouldn't happen to us again. And here we are, 70 years later, back in the soup, as it were. Many things contributed, but the basic reality is we are a kind of economic system, and it has a name, capitalism, that goes through these cycles, they're called. They're called business cycles because they've been around as long as capitalism has been around. Every 4 to 7 years, there's a downturn. Sometimes they're short and shallow, other times they're long and deep. We're in one that's long and deep, and there's really no way to get out of this now other than to change the system. Because in terms of reforms, of the kind that Obama did and that the kind that followed the crash in 2008. That's a kind of replay of the reforms we did, in some cases literally, after the crash of 1929, and it just doesn't work, which is why we have now a situation in which the country is very upset. That's why Mr. Trump was elected. That's why so many people voted for Bernie Sanders on the other side of the spectrum. We're literally living in an economy that's limping, even though the unemployment rate is down. Let's be really clear about what happened. Millions of people left the labor force. If those people hadn't done that, the unemployment rate would be much higher. Number two, the jobs people have are much poorer jobs than those they lost in 2008 and 9. The jobs today have lower wages. The jobs today have less security. The jobs today come with fewer benefits. When you put all that together, it's not surprising that people are in great trouble. And the real danger confronting us is that if Mr. Trump goes through with what he has said he will do, and if the Republicans do likewise, then these limping economic situations are going to get worse.
So, given everything that we know about Donald Trump and the Republicans, what should we expect from them specifically? If they're successful in getting what they want, what impact will that have both short-term and long-term for our economy?
Well, at this point, most of what we've seen is kind of smoke and mirrors, theatrics. Let me give you an example. Not letting the Carrier Corporation move 2,100 jobs into Mexico, but to move less than that, perhaps 1,100 jobs or something like that. This is not going to change much of anything, but it's lots of hoopla. Even if Mr. Trump were to carry through and really do a number on stopping American corporations from competing in a world economy by going to cheap, low-wage areas like Mexico, all that you're going to make those companies do is try to compete in another way. How will they do that? Well, the major way of the last 30 years has been automation. First the computer, then the robot. And the result of that will be more unemployment, more of a problem with good jobs disappearing, this time not replaced by low-wage jobs in Mexico, but by a robot. This is a system that works this way, and there's nothing Mr. Trump has proposed that deals with that fundamental problem. He will stop this or that, maybe, but he will not stop the response of the business community, which is the problem at the base.
You're describing technological advances and how they impact the average worker. I mean, we can go back to the 1830s and the invention of the steam engine. We can go to the early 20th century and the development of the assembly line. We can look through, you know, obviously all the developments in the 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, electronically and digitally, shall we say. They've all had an impact on the job market, and somehow it seems like we made it through all of those. How do we make it through this, through robots and computers reducing, you know, making some people redundant? I mean, we've seen it with checkout clerks and I mean, that's the easiest example, you know, swipe your own stuff in the supermarket sort of thing. Are you not confident that we'll figure out a way to get through this too, or is this one that is so different in some way that we have to fundamentally change the system to respond to it?
Good question. No one knows what exactly the future will bring. Is it possible that we will have robots and nonetheless we will find some kind of job for people to do? Yeah, it's possible. But let's remember, it is also possible that we won't, that the rest of the world will go on to produce in ways that will make it impossible for the United States to wiggle its way out of a situation where it can't go to Mexico because it has a president who needs to work that way, and it somehow will have robots, but somehow it won't work out. We don't know the answer to these questions, but what we do know is, over the last 40 years, when we've had robotization, when we've had computers, the promise that they would relieve us of arduous work has been broken. People are doing longer hours of arduous work today than they ever did. The promise of that technology, not delivered. The promise that the technology would keep us working, that hasn't worked out real well either, since, as I pointed out, the unemployment rate is actually very high when you count the people who have left because they don't even think they can find a job. And a recent study by two economists, one at Princeton and one at Harvard, Lawrence Katz and I forget the other guy's name, they pointed out that of the jobs that were created, more than ever in American history, they're insecure jobs, they're temporary jobs, they're the new gig economy jobs, which is a polite way of saying insecure, no benefits. So in fact, we already see that allowing technology to be put into place for profit purposes produces changes in the reality of working people's lives that are not only not desirable, but are terrifying to most people, especially when they look down the road as to where more of this can lead.
So, well, I want to get into the kind of solution stuff toward the end of our conversation in the next segment.
Fine.
But in the 3 minutes we have left in this segment, it's become conventional wisdom that Donald Trump isn't a normal Republican because of his comparatively protectionist views on trade. If he follows through on his promises to change NAFTA or put tariffs on Chinese goods, what would that mean both for the U.S. economy and the politics of trade?
Well, I'm afraid here the prospectus that I would offer is frightening. If you actually go through with this, in a way, then the Trump administration is declaring war on the most important large corporations in American society, who have invested hundreds of billions of dollars over the last 25 years in China, in India, in Brazil, in countless other places, on the premise that they could produce there, pay low wages, and bring that stuff back into the United States and sell it to a working class that can afford it. If that's going to be blocked, they're going to be out a great deal of money. They will become the enemies of Mr. Trump, and he cannot afford that, having not really won the election, as we know anyway. So what is Mr. Trump going to do? He told us he's going to give them a tax cut, reduce the corporate tax rate from 35%, if he gets his way, to 15%. The Republicans say they want 20%. Whatever the case may be, you're suddenly going to take a vast amount of money away from the federal government if you do that. That may be nice for the corporations, a kind of compensation for what he's doing to their ability to ship goods back to America. But meanwhile, it's going to bankrupt the government of the United States. How is he going to handle that? Lay off public employees? Raise taxes on the rest of us? Mr. Trump is going to discover very quickly that his idea of manipulating trade has many more problems than the glib comments on the campaign trail that he offered us from time to time. And one last quick thing. If you do that to Mexico or China or India, you are striking a blow against those economies that they may not recover from. And do we really want to have that kind of confrontation? There's a nasty history in the history of the human race of trade wars becoming military wars because you're threatening the economic survival, certainly of Mexico. Do we want a destroyed society halfway there already, going the rest of the way in Mexico? These are consequences that people aren't discussing, but they're the real cost of what the man is proposing.
That's extraordinary. More with Richard Wolff right after the break. Welcome back to The Big Picture. I'm speaking with Dr. Richard Wolff, Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor at the New School in New York City, founder of Democracy Works, and author of the new book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. Dr. Wolff, what impact would the repeal of Obamacare have on our economy?
Well, I really appreciate that you asked the question because it's one of the topics about which the level of confusion excels beyond what it normally is with such issues. The issue of repealing Obamacare has little or nothing to do with the details of how that act, the Obamacare Act, actually worked. It's clear that it extended health insurance, to millions of Americans who didn't have it before. It was a scandal what we had before, and this bill at least did part of the job of correcting that. It was not successful in cutting back on health care costs, which it should have been. So it's a mixed bag like most of these bills are. But repealing it has nothing to do with the details of medical care or coverage. Well, what does it have to do with? Everything about economics. This bill was paid for. The medical insurance exchanges, the subsidies for poor people that are built into it. It was paid for by two specific taxes, both of which have the following quality. They do not affect you unless you make more than $200,000 a year as an individual, or $200,050. It's not my day today. As a couple. In other words, only the top few percentage of the earners in America had to pay the tax. By repealing the Affordable Care Act, you are saving the richest Americans huge amounts of taxes. For example, 80% of the tax cut will go to the millionaires in America. They will get 80%.
By tax cut, you're talking about, by repealing Obamacare, you're talking about.
That's right. If you repeal Obamacare, you are cutting the taxes for the richest Americans. That's why it's being done. It's a kind of payback of Republicans and Trump for the wealthy people that have supported them and put them into office. It's a very old game. It is being covered over by language about health care, but it's actually a tax cut for the rich, and that's the core of what it is. And if it means that we will have bad health outcomes in this country, that millions of people will lose it, that's collateral damage to what is first and foremost a tax cut for the rich.
Amazing. What, in your opinion, does the future hold for millennials? They already face the brunt of America's economic problems. Do you expect their conditions to get worse under President Trump?
Yes, I expect that, in fact, the refusal even to think about raising the minimum wage, the fact that the government will now be run by people that don't even want the $15 an hour kind of standard to be established in this country, all of that will create cheap mass service sector jobs, which is where the millennials are going to go. And they're going to discover, as they already have, that the debts they undertook to go to college and university will not be paid back by the kinds of income they can earn. They're going into an economy that is more and more temporary jobs, gig jobs, without benefits, without pensions to look forward to. Their situation is going to be more and more what in Europe is called not the proletariat anymore, but the precariat, the people whose whole economic situation is one of trying to make do, a little of this, a little of that, none of the older middle-class job security that was once what capitalism in America boasted it provided to the working class.
So how real is the danger that Trump could turn the U.S. into a kleptocracy, or are we already there simply via the agency of campaign contributions and super PACs?
Well, I think we are already there. I don't think Mr. Trump is going to change any of that. He may make it marginally worse, but basically he's settling into a government of billionaires who are very comfortable with going a little bit to the right wing for a while. And if that doesn't work out, goodbye, Mr. Trump. We'll bring in someone who's a little bit left of Mr. Trump. What's the difference as long as the basic mechanisms of this kind of economic system are reproduced? And that's what's happened. It's what's happened through Bush and Clinton. It didn't really matter. Even Obama didn't shake any of that. That's why they're quite comfortable at the top, even if Mr. Trump is somewhat outrageous, even if Mr. Trump goes too far towards the right. Okay, their view is, we'll get rid of him in 4 years, bring in somebody less controversial, as long as the underlying mechanisms are basically left alone, we're happy. For the rest of the American people, this is no better news looking down the road than we have just gone through in the last 25 years, and particularly since the crash of 2008.
Speaking of crashes, back in the 1930s during the last crash, it's often argued that Franklin Roosevelt was seeing, on the one hand, the rise of fascism, and on the other hand, the rise of communism, and that he chose this middle path of rescuing capitalism by heavily regulating it. Do you see analogies or parallels today to the crisis that FDR faced? And what are the solutions that you would suggest if A, do you think that his solutions would work again, you know, making the government the employer of last resort, re-empowering unions, all those kind of things? Or do we need to have a complete remake of our system?
Let me respond two ways. I think that if Mr. Trump and the Republicans make the situation for the mass of Americans even worse than it has been over the last few years, the American people will throw those fellows out as eagerly as they brought them in, if not more so. At that point, yes, you could have another Rooseveltian kind of move, a sudden shift to the left, a Bernie Sanders type of person being elected who would have the government be the employer of last resort, who would clamp down on high incomes, raise the taxes very high on wealthy people the way Roosevelt did, and so on, because it would be a society that was so riven by tension and trouble that there would be an overwhelming support for that sort of thing. That may happen. But then I have to tell you very honestly, this kind of thing that Roosevelt did, well, we've been there and we've done that. It did get us out of the Great Depression. But as a long-term solution, so we wouldn't be back in this situation again, it wasn't successful. The reforms either didn't work or they didn't last. So if all we do is that again, reforms more or less like that, well, then I think we have to face the fact we will likely once again see that they either don't work or they don't last. And the reason they don't last and the reason they don't work is that we are afraid as a society to take the last step, to say it isn't a question of reforming the system, we need a new and different system. And the way I would describe it, as you know, is an old idea, ancient in fact. Worker cooperatives, to change the way businesses are organized, factories, offices, stores, so that democracy actually works there, that all the people share in the decisions upon which their economic lives depend. And I am confident that if workers together made the decisions, they wouldn't give a handful of people millions or billions of dollars while everybody else has trouble putting their kids through school. They wouldn't move the factories out of the country because it would be to destroy their own jobs and their own communities. We would have a different society. Another way to say it, instead of fighting over how to redistribute the unequal wealth and income our capitalist system produces, why don't we decide that rather than fight over redistribution, let's not distribute it so unequally in the first place? And the only way to institutionalize that, the only way to make that the governing rule, is to make the worker co-op, the collective decision of what goes on inside each business, be the new way we do it, so we don't have a tiny group of people with all the power at the top of each business and then be apparently surprised that they take care of themselves first and foremost, and the rest of us not so much.
I suspect, though, if you were to propose that as a package, A, that tiny group of people with all the money and power at the top of the pyramid would fight, and secondly, the main argument that would be used by their defenders probably wouldn't be, we're here to defend the fat cats. They would be saying, you know, the next entrepreneur, the next Steve Jobs, the next Bill Gates or whatever, isn't going to bother starting a business because, hey, there's no big upside to it, so why bother? How would you respond to that? What do we do about that?
Well, two things. One, if we want to believe, I happen not to, but if we want to believe that big breakthroughs in technology require that the person who makes them becomes very wealthy, let's do it. Let's give them an extraordinary reward for their breakthrough. But that's no rationale and no warrant after they pass on to continue doing that. We reward the one who made the breakthrough. After that, we go back to a democratic arrangement where everybody who depends on the production of whatever they figured out can continue to have a reasonable life and participate. So you can always give outsized rewards if that's what you think motivates people to do these sorts of things. As to the people at the top fighting, of course they will. The people who ran the slave systems fought against the overturning of slavery. In the end, they lost. The lords who presided over feudalism for 1,000 years in Europe, they fought against the end of feudalism. They lost eventually. And guess what? The people at the top who are controlling, and with more and more meanness, an economy in which the mass of people are having a harder and harder time, they think they will always be strong enough to prevent the pushback that their behavior is creating. Well, the slave masters made that mistake, the feudal lords made that mistake, and the people who sit at the top of capitalism seem to be in the process of having not learned from history. They will be condemned to undergo it again.
We have just a minute left. How do we make that transition? I mean, the end of feudalism and the end of slavery were both accompanied by bloody wars. How do we make that transition in a way that's less violent?
Well, my hope is that Americans will see, and people in other countries too, that precisely your point. We don't want it to be that way. So let's do it in a quiet way. And here's a little vignette. In Fridley, Minnesota, over the last 2 or 3 years, a group of poor people occupying a mobile home, the Park Plaza mobile home community, got together and cooperatively bought out the company that was not well maintaining their mobile home community. And they are now managing it as a cooperative, and they're doing the business of maintaining it as a cooperative. No big violence, no big problem, but a systematic recognition that cooperative work arrangements are a better way to build an economy than the capitalist system we have now.
Yeah, and presumably we could build incentives into the system, into the tax system and everything else to promote that.
If we were willing to go that direction, that's right.
Professor Richard Wolff, it is always an honor and a pleasure to have you with us, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
And that's the way it is tonight. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it.